Maninnaide te apelle iadio Achilleus. Ollo minan hemiria caio salge itac. Ollas diptimus psychas aidi proiapsen. Hero nautus de helloria teo cecinessin. Oi noi site pas idios de teleeto bule. Ex hude tapro tadias te tenerisante. Atre ides te anaxandron cae dios Achilleus. Yes, do you like this? So begin Homer Iliad. So it start. Welcome Caribbean Rhythm, episode 134, number one sexy show in the world. And I will explain later why I recite Greek in that way. Later on show, I will do segment, recite more from this epic. In fact, I brag to you that I do it from memory, as I have the first 150 or so lines memorized, along with other favorite passages. This very personal topic for me is one of my favorite book. And of course, my own book, tongue-in-cheek though it is, entitled Bronze Age Mindset, is in part a restatement of what I see as spirit of Homer, though I do not hide that it is through Nietzsche and such that I came to true meaning of Homer. But anyways, that is beginning of Iliad. Do you like this sound? The first word, as many point out, is manis. Manin is just another case. And yes, language does have pitch accent. I will say later why and how. But is word often translated as wrath, a kind of anger, you know. So, but it's not book report. If you want plot details of Iliad, maybe you read it or you look Wikipedia even. But here I just give you scattered observations on my own favorite moments and idea from book. And yes, but point often made is story of Achilles' anger, a kind of anger or wrath. Really how him feels slighted. He felt his honor slighted because they took his war bride away. So he sat out most of the war, and him sitting out the war means the Trojans get the upper hand and many Greeks die. And this is what Homer is referring to in opening lines here. I will read translation of the, that's basically the introduction of Iliad, what I just read. And now I read Latimore translation, which I also recommend for you. Sing goddess, I'm reading now. Sing goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished. Since that time, when first stood in division of conflict, Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilleus. Yes, you see, he chose to sit out the war out of an overwhelming sense of honor and frank, uncompromising, individualistic egotism, which for all talk of individualism and such in our time, most of you mamzers would do well to emulate that kind of ancient egotism, since it is because of modern man's very timid, very unacquisitive, unselfish character that the world is now given over to evil. If a single general in the Brazilian military, for example, during the recent commotions in that country with Bolsonaro and so forth, I'm not talking about Bolsonaro himself, there's nothing he could have done, and the people did all they could. But if a single general had read my book, and I say my book because they're not going to read Homer or Nietzsche, and even if they do, they will not understand those writers. And they're not going to read Homer and Nietzsche, you know. But even my book is probably beyond the pale mind of such a normal fag as would have risen through the Brazilian ranks to something like general. But let's say if they had read it and took upon themselves its basic spirit, they would have said, to hell with caution, I'll reach for the brass ring, I'll overthrow this regime, I'll institute myself in a caretaker position, which they could have done very easily. I know for a fact all the soldiers at the soldier level, the captain level, would have been 100% on board with this, would have joined whatever general did that, and most of the Brazilian population as well, including its effective part, meaning the people with properties. So a nation would have been saved by one man's feeling of honor, selfish feeling of gain, desire for distinction and renown. Remember, Achilles is upset, I tell you, because war bride taken away from your prize girl that he took on a raid
But men today are so timid and so in awe of fear and of social censure, and I suspect of their wives. And I was thinking the other day, where is Lady Macbeth of our time? Since all these men are slaves to their wives, at least if there was a Lady Macbeth. But no, not even a Lady Macbeth. Because Lady Macbeth was a woman in a man's world. She was a monster woman, but in a man's... And today women are still monsters, but they're women monsters in a woman's and an old farts world. And so you don't get Lady Macbeth. You get instead Wuhan hysteria, in place of them goading on their men to reach for the ring prize, you see. But for all the bluster today and the self-help talk and motivational and such, the aims and the stakes are so small. Nobody reaches for a big thing. We live in an age of unmanned timidity and of deference to public opinion. Or otherwise, despite all the risks, at least one general there would have said, I don't care. I can die trying this. I don't care. Here's my chance to become undisputed leader of a huge nation, and I will be remembered throughout all history. By the way, once it happens in one country, if I can convince the militaries of, maybe not something like Upper Volta, right? That's the joke, Upper Volta, or Botswana, or Malawi. But if I can convince leaders of a half-civilized nation, even like Brazil, I'll take FTW, fuck the world. They take power. Once it happened in one country, it will be copied in many others. But no. Well, at least it did not start in Brazil. Because the generals are old fart men like that guy, Miley, and the other in the United States. Well, look, take this for introduction if you want. This show on Homer, the first of 2 parts. Next week I will discuss books and ideas about Homer. Not quite secondary literature in usual sense, as in scholarship and such, but the ideas of Nietzsche from Homer's Contest and of Dominic Venner from a special book that my friend Blosius translated. I hope you'll get this book, the handbook. I will promote it soon. You'll go to account Blosius. He has... I've shown it to you in the past. Don't make me explain. He has a handbook by Venner where he talk about Homer. And then there is another man, Adam Nicholson, in book The Mighty Dead, Why Homer Matters. And there also, I think I will talk Alasdair MacIntyre, who you may all know from his Christian Marxist book After Virtue. But he also has a take on Homer, or rather on Nietzsche's Homer, which my friend Second City Bureaucrat recently discussed on his Substack. You all subscribe maybe, but that's for next week. This episode, just my own joy at Homer, why I like him. And the first time I read him, I was not that young. I was maybe, I think, 18. I read the Lattimore translation. It hit me very powerful effect in ways that maybe it wouldn't have hit my peers who had not read Nietzsche. Nietzsche did indeed prime me for understand Homer well. I had been reading Nietzsche very much so since I was about 16 or around there. And, he just explodes all moral fag ways of thinking and judging. So then you're ready to receive the luminous images of Homer, who is a thinker and bard beyond morality, which is why it's so stupid, for example, when critics today try to force tedious lesson or kind of sermon on his poems, as if, the Iliad is about men's inhumanity to men and the terrors and sadness of war and other such. When, of course, it's a book about the glory and excitement of war. Men love war. Now don't confuse that with modern drudgery police actions. I'll talk about modern fake states and their scam wars later, but men love war. They love adventure, and this is why even highly intellect men like Descartes and Nietzsche wanted to pursue career in military. And this is why, if you read about men like La Rochefoucauld, a great self-thinker and aphorist, who I will cover on future episode, but he had swashbuckling, exciting life of politics and war and intrigue. They're all the same thing, ideally. While La Rochefoucauld, he was also, while he was doing this swashbuckling, he was also a great philosopher and consummate stylist. Men love the adventure of war, and this image in Greek myth and poems, just central, understand Greek spirit. I mean, this is idea again and again discussed, expressed in most frank and uncompromising way throughout the vital life of the Greeks, meaning the part of that people's history when they had true greatness, before the time of Alexander. So, for example, Pindar just casually refers to this on more than one occasion. when discussing, for example, the voyage of the Argonauts, Jason and the Argonauts, and Jason is gathering them, the way that in action movie they gather the entourage at beginning. And he just casually makes asides like, they wanted to pursue the elixir of excellence and did not want to stay by their mother's side, but to find eternal renown, And Xenophon, the writer, Xenophon, the student of Socrates, please excuse if I occasional tongue-tied during this episode. I am still oppressed by jet lag. It doesn't stop. And overstimulation by coffees, perhaps. But Xenophon, student of Socrates, though he certainly did not need to, he embarked on a great adventure that he described in book Anabasis, when he and many other Greek, and these were wealthy sons of patrician men, but they just decide to go seek their fortune in the Orient as mercenaries for a charming Persian prince who tries to overthrow the empire. And there are just frank references to, we came here to pursue glory and a great name and adventure. What's wrong with admitting that? No, I want to pursue service. And there's the famous reference, in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is talking about his life as a pirate, which, as Thucydides later explains, the Greeks of this time, meaning of, let's say, 900, 800 BC, when the Iliad, let's say the bardic tradition of the Iliad was already in full height. And it describes in part the Greece of that time, Homer, although he says that he described the Greeks of the Bronze Age, or rather the end of the Bronze Age, but it's really the Greeks of, let's say, 900, 800 BC or so. But the audience of that time, as Thucydides says, did not see piracy as anything bad at all, but it was even honorable. And Odysseus, speaking in character of a pirate, he has a beautiful line, something like, "Work was never a pleasure for me, nor homekeeping thrift which nourishes good children. But for me oared ships were always a pleasure, and wars, and well-polished spears and arrows." Well, I think that kind of mindset attractive to almost any man, complete forbidden today, I think, but it lies, I think, heart of Greek adventuring spirit. And there are many similar instances in the Iliad. Of course, their Bible, the Iliad was the Bible of the ancient Greeks. And so I give you now, for example, this is from book 13. Okay, and I will read a slightly longer passage, Latimore translation again. Aias, the son of Telamon, spoke to him in answer. "So for me also now, the invincible hands on my spear shaft are furious. My strength is rising, and both feet beneath me are sweeping me onward, so that I long even more for single combat with Hector, Priam's son, the forever avid of battle." Now, as these two were saying such things to each other, joyful in the delight of battle the god had put into their spirits, meanwhile the earth encircler stirred up the Achaeans behind them. So, the delight of battle that the god had put into their spirits, and then the contrast between safe stay-at-home domesticity and this delight in battle and adventure is made very plainly at what some consider to be the early height or climax of the Iliad, the rousing passages right before the catalogue of ships, which is when the catalogue of ships is in book 2, when Homer lists the entire order of battle of the Greek army, all the captains, their ships, where they were from, their lineage. It is maybe the most biblical part of the Iliad, and would have been very important for ancient Greeks, as many of the heroes listed there were the founders of their own dynasties or states or so forth. So when Agamemnon and Nestor are rousing the Achaeans and arranging them in battle, and Homer says of Athena, and again I read for you now, this, and they, the god-supported kings, about Agamemnon ran marshalling the men, and among them grey-eyed Athena, holding the dear treasured Aegis, ageless, immortal, from whose edges float 100 all-golden tassels, each one carefully woven, and each worth 100 oxen. With this fluttering, she swept through the host of the Achaeans, urging them to go forward. She kindled the strength in each man's heart to take the battle without respite, and to keep on fighting. And now battle became sweeter to them than to go back in their hollow ships to the beloved land of their fathers. And the words used here, patri da Gaia, and literally fatherland, it meant something quite different for this audience. It meant the land of your fathers, in which their graves are, which was a big reason, as I might be repeating, a big reason for private property, because the graves of your ancestors were on your land if you were a man of property. But it had a real, as opposed to a fantastical and propagandistic meaning, as the word fatherland has for fake modern states. But such people who loved their fatherlands, literally the land your father was from, maybe that was more important than the land your mother was from, but actually they often gave honor to lineages of both mother and father. But even such people who loved their homelands, they didn't take kindly idea of you stay home and not have adventures of war and such, which, in European history proper also, in knightly history and its immediate offspring of knightly history, meaning in the Renaissance and 17th and 18th century, when, let's say, aristocratic, knightly enterprising spirit was carried forward and changed in various ways. And then, even until recently, the woman-led house husband was a figure of ridicule, seen much like you see the cuck now. He is in fact a cuck, whether he's actually cucked or not. And the PUA, all due respect to my PUA artiste friends, was also seen as kind of a cuck. For example, Paris is what would be called in modern PUA language the alpha male. He's a seducer of women. And the other men in the Iliad don't really have a lot of respect for him. They say he's just a despoiler of virgins and such, which, well, that, admirer of the rosy cheek of a virgin, do you like that? I mean, probably Achilles' war bride herself was a teenage girl. Am I allowed to say that on the air? It's just a fact of life from Iliad is also in the Bible, if I may. But finally, there is the plot of the Iliad itself, which is the story of Achilles, who deliberately, knowingly chooses a short and glorious life because his mother is a goddess and tells him he has this choice to make. You make a short and glorious life if you go and you avenge your friend and you go to Troy to fight, or one that is long, will have prosperity and domestic tranquility at home, but you will have no glory and renown. And that thing, renown, fame in the real sense of everlasting fame through the ages, deification by a great bard and poet, this is what Achilles, of course, he chooses this, Achilles being, let's say, the most admired man by all Greek aristocrats throughout Greek history, again, at least through their vital period. But it's not just Greek, it's what all Aryan society, whether it be in Greek or Rig Vedas, or the Irish or Icelandic epics and many others such, this is what they sought as highest thing, ever-flowing fame among mortals. And this, although I was not aware of all this history at the time, when I first read this book, this what impressed me the most. Although when I first read the Iliad, it's not even right to call it that it present a new and different moral code. It's just another way entirely of looking at the world and of looking at life that is so alien to our Chinese time with its Chinese fake morals and Chinese type fake self-effacing men. And it's, I suppose you could call it a secularized post-Christian morality, a distortion even of Christianity, although Machiavelli, already in his time, when I guess there was no secularization yet, I suppose, but he blames a false interpretation of Christianity for having made the world weak, of having made it forget striving after greatness of the great Greek and Roman men. He seeks to revive that, and he says it is compatible with Christianity, but it has to be reformed. But he blames what was the Christianity of the priests, of having ruined the preconditions for freedom and for having given the world over to evil men who can rule unopposed because of the lack of manhood and defiance in most others. So especially, I mean again the corruption of the priests and such, and the things they affect in the spirits of men. But look to the conflict between the Guelphs and Ghibellines in Italy and elsewhere, which in our time, can you say there is a Ghibelline faction anymore at all? But the priests in our time are the secularized version of Christo-Judean so-called morality that you find in the ethics of socialism and of the type of rule described by Auguste Comte. So it's a complete victory of Judea over Rome, as Nietzsche says, after the French Revolution. Such a cloying, egalitarian, moralistic, anti-natural prison of the mind and of the body. But anyways, this bracing new fresh air, I felt something entirely new that Nietzsche was talking about, reading Homer, in particular the Iliad. This so-called alternative morality, it doesn't just appear in large movements of the plot, by the way, or in large themes of the book, but most of all, in particular scenes. For example, in the self-assertive trash talking that you see just before duels and such, and also in many of the battle scenes themselves, the graphic, brutal, prehistoric, gruesome scenes. Let me read you a few examples, because sometimes, they make me chuckle, but in a good way, as in, what is this? It's so unusual to our sensibilities and presented so frankly and naively that it is refreshing. So here is example not of trash talk so much as it's a battle scene interlude, an interlude in the middle of a big chaotic battle where somebody gives advice to somebody else. I am reading now. Now Menelaus of the great war cry captured Adrestos alive, for his 2 horses bolting over the level land got entangled in a tamarisk growth and shattered the curving chariot at the tip of the pole. So they, broken free, went on toward the city where many besides stampeded in terror. So Adrestos was whirled beside the wheel from the chariot, headlong into the dust on his face. And the son of Atreus, Menelaus, with the far-shadowed spear in his hand, stood over him. But Adrestos, catching him by the knees, supplicated, "Take me alive, son of Atreus, and take appropriate ransom. In my rich father's house the treasures lie piled in abundance. Bronze is there, and gold, and difficultly wrought iron. And my father would make you glad with abundant repayment, so were he to hear that I am alive by the ships of the Achaeans." So he spoke and moved the spirit inside Menelaus, and now he was on the point of handing him to a henchman to lead back to the fast Achaean ships. But Agamemnon came on the run to join him and spoke his word of argument. "Dear brother, O Menelaus, are you so concerned, so tenderly with these people? Did you in your house get the best of treatment from the Trojans? No, let not one of them go free of sudden death in our hands. Not the young man-child that the mother carries still in her body, not even he, but let all of Ilion's people perish, utterly blotted out and unmourned for." The hero spoke like this, and bent the heart of his brother since he urged justice. Menelaus shoved with his hand Adrestos the warrior back from him, and powerful Agamemnon stabbed him in the side, and as he writhed over, Atreides, setting his heel upon the midriff, wrenched out the ash spear. Nestor, in a great voice, cried out to the men of Argos, "O beloved Danaan fighters, henchmen of Ares, let no man any more hang back with his eye on the plunder, designing to take all the spoil he can gather back to the vessels. Let us kill the men now, and afterwards at your leisure all along the plain you can plunder the perished corpses." So he spoke and stirred the spirit and strength in each man. Okay, now isn't that great? I'm not a sadist, but such a jarring and frank statement, of the matter of fact. It's not presented, none of this is presented as anything other than just normal and just. As for the trash talking, it's also one of the best parts to see warriors face off and present their lineage, and then they attack each other in words, again without any concession to our effeminate morality, but in full embrace of their self-aggrandizement and lust for fame and for violence. For example, scenes like this are throughout the Iliad, but just an example or two. This isn't even the most representative. It's just one of my favorites for its shameless bluster and cruelty. I'm reading now. There, Idomeneus, graying though he was, called on the Danaans and charged in upon the Trojans and drove panic among them, for he killed Othryneus, a man who had lived in Cabessos and who was newly come in the wake of rumor of war, and had asked Priam for the hand of the loveliest of his daughters, Cassandra, without bride price, but had promised a great work for her, to drive back the unwilling sons of the Achaeans from Troy land. And aged Priam had bent his head in assent and promised to give her. So Othryneus fought in the faith of his promises. Idomeneus aimed at him with the shining spear and threw it, and hit him as he came onward with high stride, and the corselet of bronze he wore could not hold, the spear fixed in the middle belly. He fell thunderously, and Idomeneus, vaunting, cried out, Ostrioneus, I congratulate you beyond all others. If it is here that you will bring to pass what you promised to Dardanian Priam, who in turn promised you his daughter. See now, we also would make you a promise, and we would fulfill it. We would give you the loveliest of Atreides' daughters, and bring her here from Argos to be your wife if you joined us and helped us storm the strong-founded city of Ilion. Come then with me, so we can meet by our seafaring vessels about a marriage. We here are not bad matchmakers for you. The hero Idomeneus spoke and dragged him through the strong encounter caught by the foot. But now Asios came to stand by him, dismounted ahead of the horses, whom his henchmen held ever behind him, so that they breathed on his shoulders. He was striving in all his fury to strike Idomeneus, but he too, quick with a spear cast, struck him in the gorge underneath the chin and drove the bronze clean through. He fell as when an oak tree goes down, or a white poplar, or like a towering pine tree which in the mountains the carpenters have hewn down with their whetted axes to make a ship timber. So he lay there, felled in front of his horses and chariot, roaring and clawed with his hands at the bloody dirt. Okay, end quote. Do you like this? In fact, the deaths of warriors are frequently compared to the feeling of beautiful trees. I will talk about this on next segment. It's some of the most beautiful part of Iliad. I love the battle scenes. It's also a very graphic, brutal, uncompromising. This from Book 5. First to Diomedes, called out the shining son of Lycaon. Valiant and strong-spirited, O son of proud Tydeus. He's calling out to Diomedes now, the son of Tydeus. You were not beaten then by the bitter arrow, my swift shot. Now I will try with the throwing spear to see if I can hit you. So he spoke and balanced the spear, far-shadowed, and threw it, and struck the son of Tydeus in the shield, and the flying bronze spearhead was driven clean through and into the corselet. And the shining son of Lycaon cried aloud in a great voice, Now you are struck clean through the middle, and I think that you will not hold up for much longer. You have given me great claim to glory. Then strong Diomedes answered, not frightened before him, You did not hit me, you missed. But I do not think that you too will go free until one or the other of you has fallen to glut with his blood Ares, the god who fights under the shield's guard. He spoke and threw, and Pallas Athene guided the weapon to the nose next to the eye and cut on through the white teeth, and the bronze weriless shore all the way through the tongue's base, so that the spearhead came out underneath the jawbone. He dropped then from the chariot, and his armor clattered upon him, dazzling armor and shining, while those fast-running horses shied away, and there his life and his strength were scattered. But here it is in this last passage I read for you, and all of such shocking, well, to a modern or moral so-called orientation, and to an effeminate, docile, oriental, self-effacing culture such as ours, it's shocking. But I mean shocking and refreshing statements in the Iliad regarding the hero's unashamed, frank desire not only for plunder and adventure, but for immortal fame, undying fame. Which, when I've mentioned it on Twitter and such, I was given stern lectures and finger-wagging by serious, traditional men. Now, serious men does not pursue fame. No, you are good, you are above that. But tell me what this attitude, what has it added to mankind? Because it hasn't made men better, this moralism. Because men will continue to desire these kinds of things Homer and other writers talk about, but then they just lie to themselves and they lie to others about it, and they force such instincts then to become subterranean, and then they seek satisfaction in ever more loathsome and passive-aggressive forms, mendacious forms, of which the denatured lust for power of the priestly types, they're always hiding behind sweet-sounding moralisms. That's the most loathsome of all. And you're just blasted with it now non-stop if you're surrounded by these kind of moralistic leftist culture, the Reddit culture. But how refreshing then to hear all this. And this is one of my favorite parts of the Iliad, what I will read for you now, the beginning of Book 5. One of my favorite parts, this is Diomedes' Aristea. Diomedes, a Greek hero, the Aristea, his moment of glory. And let me read, actually, here I will recite the first short stanza lines. The intro of the book 5, I will recite first in Greek.
Intautyde I dig Diomede I Pallas Athene, do kemenos kai tarsosin ekdelos metapasin, argeois igenoito idekleos estlonaroito, daiehoi ekkorytos tekai aspidosa kamaton pyr, asterhoporinoi enalinkion hostemalista, lampron pampaineis idellumenos occhianoio, toion hoi pyr daiena po kratos tekai homon, orsedenin katamesson hoti pleistoi cloneonto.
Yes, and now I will read for you a translation. There to Tydeus' son Diomedes, Pallas Athena granted strength and daring, that he might be conspicuous among all the Argives and win the glory of valor. That's not really a correct translation, I think. Kleos estlon aroito is more like win himself a noble fame, or a true and noble fame. But anyway, I continue. She granted him strength and daring, that he might become conspicuous among all the Argives and win himself a noble fame. She made weariless the fire blaze from his shield and helmet, like that star of the waning summer, who beyond all stars rises, bathed in the ocean stream to glitter in brilliance. Such was the fire she made blaze from his head and his shoulders, and urged him into the middle fighting, where the most were struggling. And the same image, but bigger, is repeated at the moment of Achilles' own Aristea, or height of glory, when later in the Iliad he come out of retirement to avenge his friend Patroclus, which really is the theme of the book, the real theme. The demonstration and exhibition of Achilles' superiority as the best of the Achaeans. Whereas the wrath, the menace, the first word, which I will talk about on the final segment of this episode, I think, but that is just a part of the story of his distinction as the best of the Achaeans. But I like how straightforward such desires and longings are presented, without apology and fussing, without dissimulation and moralism and false piety. No, it's not false piety, there is real piety. They're not afraid to pray to the gods for concrete gifts and to arrange an exchange of gifts with their gods. It's very different from Asiatic conception of one god, which the dissimulator and the false actor Plato tries to introduce. Plato was also wrong about many other things, such as the soul. You will see, perhaps even from passages I have already read, when he talks about heroes dying in battle, and he says their armor clanged upon them. And now I am like that woman the Korean woman in the subway who cannot say mental retard, and she fumbles mentally retarded, the word. I don't know if you remember this hero woman, the Korean, but Plato was wrong when Homer talked about the heroes dying and they fall with a thud with their armor clanging about them. And he frequently says, and a mist came over their eyes. And you can see similar sentiment in the opening stanza, that the opening, the introductions that I read for you at the beginning, where their souls, whatever, it's their bodies became carrion, their bodies became food for dogs and birds, but their souls, whatever, and he has some other lines like, the soul went chattering away to Hades. It didn't really matter. This so-called thing, the soul, is not actually what is animating your body and who you are. It's not important to understand who you are. And so this vision of body and of what man is, that is different both from a modern and from the Platonic Jewish Christian type of thing, But more on that later. I break now and I come back to discuss my other favorite aspect of the Iliad, which is what transfigures this, what might sound as a terrible, uncompromising, violent world, but it's very vivid, prophetic, even similes. My other part of the favorite part of the Iliad that made such impression on me is the simile, and I come back to discuss that. A moment, please. Before discuss luminous similes in Homer, I think I will recite for you the first 50 lines or so in ancient Greek. Let me say a word about why I pronounce the way I do. Ancient Greek had a pitch accent. It also did not pronounce the vowels in the way that modern Greek does. For example, you may know the letter phi, and in modern Greek it's pronounced F, like F. But when the ancient Romans transcribed the Greek word for philosophy into Latin, they did not use their letter F. They used PH. Because, and this is not the only evidence, there's much other evidence that the letters like theta, which is today th, and phi were p and t, they were aspirated consonants, so-called. And so also many other things pronounced different than you might expect. The meter relies on quantity, not so much on stress. So this is why it might sound a little bit like Japanese, which also uses quantity. Quantity means length of a syllable, whether it's and it goes long, short, short. The dactylic hexameter. Look it up. I don't want to give long lecture on such. Also, I encourage those of you who are uninterested in hearing me recite Greek, you can simply fast forward. That's okay. I'm not offended. I decide to do a segment just on this recitation so that people can easily go past it if they don't want to. But the other aspect, the pitch, some say I exaggerated too much. There are different schools of thinking of how you should pronounce it. That ancient Greek used a pitch is indisputable. The markings that you see on an ancient Greek text, the accent that goes in the direction of the text, the accent, that rises in the direction of the text, the accent that, as you're reading the text, seems to fall, right? In French, they're called accent aigu, accent grave. Then there is, the twirly thing. I don't even know what that's called. You put it over a letter in Spanish. I do not know the technical name for it. It escaped me at the moment. But they actually are a visual representation of how you should pronounce the pitch. They were designed, they didn't exist in original Greek. They were designed later when Greek became international Hellenistic language under Alexander, and they had to put these markings to teach non-Greeks how to pronounce it, But I have a friend he is a Greek scholar and teacher. He disagrees with me. He say I over-exaggerate the pitch, and not me. I'm following a certain school of reconstructed Attic pronunciation, and he say these people who I copy over-exaggerate the pitch. He say it is used much less, but I like this sound. It sounds like some kind of space-faring language mix between Norwegian, Japanese. Something unusual like that. I believe actually perhaps original Aryan language, Proto-Indo-European so-called, sounded maybe a little bit like this. And it had absolutely the original Aryan language. I refuse to call Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European. It's a scholarly term to not have to use the word Aryan, which is really an appropriate word to use. We do not know what name the original people in question used for themselves, but Aryan is as good as any other term, and certainly they used that word for themselves in the Vedas. It is still used in Iran. It is the root of the word for Ireland, and in a few other cases, unfortunately, this is interesting fact that I like to spar with some poster friends, is that in the Finno-Ugric languages, Oria means slave. And so that's possibly an ancient encounter between the Finno-Ugrics who lived in the forests of the far north and the tundra, and perhaps they came to the south on slave raids in the steppe and took Aryans, and so for them the word Oria means slave. It's very possible that actually it is the word they use for themselves. And how stupid, for political reasons, let's get rid of it and use this thing Indo-European, which doesn't even make sense, because it's not like the Indic languages and the European languages are the fundamental cleft. It doesn't make sense to use Indo-European. Just say Aryan, But the original Aryan languages absolutely had pitch accent. And of the modern languages today that have maintained it, I think Lithuanian is the only one that has maintained the pitch accent. There are other European languages with a pitch accent, for example, Norwegian, but it's not the one inherited directly from the Aryan language. It was lost and then it was regained in Norwegian for other reasons. This frequently happens in analogous way with many other things, with population movements. For example, present-day location of Armenia around Lake Van is very likely one of the staging grounds of Aryan adventures, at least of one branch of these people, the ones who invaded, let us say, Greece, India, which they reached through Mesopotamia, and a few other places. They likely resided for a time, at least, in just south of the Caucasus Mountains. Robert Drews makes this case, and he revised it in a recent book, but I still think he maintains that is one of the staging locations for some of the Aryan invasions. Well, it's presently occupied by the Armenians. I mean that in a positive sense, occupied, inhabited by the Armenians. But just because they live there doesn't mean that they are the direct descendants of the Aryans who live there. They speak an Aryan language, but the Armenians actually came in much later from the west, from Anatolia. That area was completely depopulated. There is evidence that the Aryan people, or whatever people lived there around Lake Van, simply decided to pack up and leave wholesale, leave as a people. Very interesting why they do this. I mean, they did it because they knew through trade routes and other legends and traditions, well, there is this rich land for the taking, and we're going to go and take it, and so forth. And yes, so they had this pitch accent language, and many other archaic things were preserved in Greek. For example, the w sound, which is represented by the letter digamma, it's called. It's like, it looks somewhat like an F. It's like a gamma with a line through it, and it's a w sound. And you never hear it in pronunciation of historical Greek, but it was used in Mycenaean times, and probably right before Homer time, let's say before 800 BC or so. So the word for anax, or king, is actually wanax. And in the first line, I'm not going to use pitch accent, whatever. It was actually Ma'nin So it sounds even stranger with the digamma w sound if you were to include it. But I will not include this because, in fact, latest scholarship say that by historical, let's say 800, 700 BC or so, the digamma was no longer used in pronunciation. So now that I've given you somewhat long introduction on why I pronounce it the way I do, I will recite the first 50 lines or so, 52. And the action told here is that crisis, and that's another thing, the vowels are pronounced differently than you might think. So the upsilon is not an u, but an u, like in, you might think some Germanic or in French language, u. And then the heta is pronounced a mix between A and E, so it's a long something like that. And actually in Dorian dialect it turns completely into an A. But anyway, the priest of Apollo, Chryses, comes to beg the Achaean princes to let his daughter go. They had captured her as a war prize. And Agamemnon turns him away very rudely, dishonors him. And Chryses goes and prays to Apollo, and Apollo in anger descends, and with a twang of his evil bow, he starts to throw it at the Greeks. He starts to spread epidemic among the Greeks. And this is how the first 52 or so lines ends, with the Greek fire of the pyres, of the funeral pyres burning. Okay, so after this, now I will recite for you.
Manen näide tea pelle iadio Achilleus. Ullo minen he myria kaiois alge itake. Pollas diptimus psychasaidi proiapsen. Hero onautus de helloria teu kikynessin. Oionoi site pas idios de teleeto bole. Exudata prota diaste tenerisante, atre ideste anaxandron caidios Achilleus. Distars poeteon meridic sine ecce macestai, latus caidios fios sogar basilei coloteis, nus sonastraton orse cacan holiconto de laoi. Hune katon crusenet imasenare terra, atre idae sogar el tetoa zepinea sakaion, lysemenos de tugatra peron da pereisi apoina, stemma de conen kersin heke bolu apollonus, cruseoianas skeptroikai lisseto panta sakaius, atre ida de malista duo cosmetore laon, Atreidae te kai alloi euknami sakaioi, hymin menteoi doi en Olympia doma te contes, ec persai priamoio polineu doi cadhicestai, paida de moi lysei te pilanta da poina de kestai, hadzomenoi dios hyon heke bolona polona. In taloi men pante sepeu peme sanna kaioi, Aideis taiterea kai agla adictaia poina. Alu catre ide Agamemnoni henda ne tumoi. Alla cacos sapiei crateron depimut honitelle. Ma segeron coile sinego paraneu sikikeo. Nunde tunon te hysteronautis jonta. Ma nu toiuk raisme skeptron kai stemma teoio. Tendego ulysso prin min kai geras pisin. Meteroi ini oikoien arge ite luti patres. Histone poi comenan kai emonekos antiosan. Aliti me meretizes aoteros hoskine eai. Hose pate deisend hogeron kai petetot mytoi. Bäda keon paratina polyplois boio talases. Polla da peita peneute kion erat hogeraios. Apollonia nactiton eukomos diceleto. Glutime argyrotox hos crusenam pibebecas. Kilante zate entene doiote ipianases. Zmint heoi potetoi cariente pineon repsa, eide potetoi catapion ameri ikea. Taurone daigon tode moi creenon eldor, tisseon danaoi emadacrua soi sibelessin. Hose pateu comenos tu declue poi bossa pollon. Bäde katolympoio carenon co omenoscar, toxo moi sine conam pere peate paretran, eclangsandar oistoi epomon co omenoio, autu cine tentos hode ie nykti eoikos, hidzete peita paneuteneon metadion heeke, Deine de clangegenetar gyreoio bioio, ureas men prootene poiketo caicina sargus, autar repeit autuoi sibelos eke peuces epieis. Baal ae de pyrai nekion kayon to tamiai.
Yes, we are back, and the other part of the Iliad I great enjoy on first reading is the simile, style of the simile. Besides, I mean, that the Iliad jolted out of modern moralism complacency. Ultimately, it can jolt you out of your probable misunderstanding of human nature, and it does so not through any pedantic, argumentative means, but simply showing you free life at its height. So you recognize it. Yes, that is a natural man, in same ways that you see perfect Greek physique sculpture. You say, yes, that there's an a priori thing inside you. Say, you recognize that is what good looks like, at least if you have good taste. And men like myself of good taste should be ideally running a eugenic council for the future, where we determine, yes, this man will breed at such and such a time of the year. He will breed 200 to 300 nubile girls, and such people will be born with. This is a possible model for utopia for the future, better than AI, but perhaps AI but this is a free man and so forth. This what appears in luminous, cinematic, vivid detail in Homer. But besides this, the Iliad is wonderful to me, literally fill me with wonder still at its similes that are so, again, vivid, striking, cinematic. Lattimore himself remarks on this in the very simple introduction he makes. He lists a few of his favorite similes. This particular one is very nice. It's also one of my favorites. I am reading now. As when some Myonian woman or Carian with purple colors ivory to make it a cheek piece for horses. It lies away in an inner room, and many a rider longs to have it, but it is laid up to be a king's treasure. Two things to be the beauty of the horse, the pride of the horseman. So, Menelaus, your shapely thighs were stained with the color of blood, and your legs also, and the ankles beneath them. And it's just something so lush about the white of the ivory and the white of Menelaus' legs stained with the purple of the blood. The image language, it burns itself into your head. And of all the things that I've ever read, this made the most stylistic impression on me. I've always wondered how it is Homer able to find just such appropriate imagery that sears itself into the dream cinema in your daydream brain. And often in very unexpected ways, where it just shocks and jolts you with contrast of imagery and feeling. Here is another example Lattimore gives. And they, as storms of snow, descend to the ground incessant on a winter day, when Zeus of the councils, showing before men what shafts he possesses, brings on a snowstorm, and stills the winds asleep in the solid drift, and shrouding the peaks that tower among the mountains, and the shoulders outjutting, and the lowlands with their grasses, and the prospering work of men's hands. And the drift falls along the grey sea, the harbours and the beaches, and the surf that breaks against it is stilled, and all things elsewhere it shrouds from above with the burden of Zeus' reign heavy upon it. So numerous and incessant were the stones volleyed from both sides, some thrown on Trojans, others flung against the Achaeans by Trojans, so the whole length of the wall thundered beneath them. And the contrast between extreme beauty, silence of snow falling, and the falling of the rocks. What is being compared is the number and that they are falling from above, but the contrast between them is genius imagery. And the Iliad, you can see, is in some ways a very modernist feel book, or rather opposite. Parts of modernism are attempts to recover what the Iliad is doing. It starts, for example, in the middle of action. It jumps around in time through stories within stories, and it then tells these similes that are the literary equal to the best special effects of any movie, I think. And what is the simile? The Iliad is a form of the bard, and it's very long, but it makes use of various other traditional song and poetry forms, lower forms, and I don't mean lower. I don't mean lower as in less good, but of lesser scope, shorter, more limited instances of poetic folkways that the bard then picks up and weaves into his longer tale. This is well known by scholars of epic. For example, the bard would improvise during performance, would weave in where appropriate old women's dirges over the deaths of young warriors, or the songs of young women at fertility festivals and such. Okay, or the drinking songs of young men. And the simile itself is not just a literary device of a literary fag, let's say. It was its own traditional form of song. It was the song of the mantis, the mantic, the prophet or seer. It's the special second sight of the augur, translated into literary or poetic form. I think this has been established. It's literally a form of prophecy if done right. But to see these kinds of juxtaposed phenomena and liken them in the most appropriate way, to see a hidden connection between them expressed visually. And the visual or cinematic aspect is very important because, I give you a couple more examples of my favorite similes, but what I can't translate for you on this episode, but what you might get from reading is this book yourself, and maybe I tried now to express this in my own brief performance in Greek just in previous segment, but the experience of the epic, which was performed by a bard, it would have been combination of repetitive meter, it has a rhythm and it's repetitive, and the accompaniment would have been also an instrument, a repetitive drone-like string instrument. And the repetition then also of the formulas that the bard improvises. I mean, he improvises their location in the actual performance, but the repetition of these ancient formulas, for example, loud resounding sea, swift-footed Achilles and such, they're ritual formulas. And the Latimore translation, I think, does a decent job of conveying the brutish prehistoric feel of these. I mean, in part the meter, although he cannot produce dactylic hexameter in English, but he captures nevertheless some of the feel of the original meter and does much better on the repetition of the formulas, which he preserves, which somebody like Fagles totally misses, by the way. But in these elements I just named for you would have already been transported. If you're in the audience, you would be transported after a while in a kind of trance-like hypnotic state. The rhythm, the formulas, the repetition, the drone-like music. And then the cinematic activation of the dream eye in the similes occurs at certain times in the context of that, So it has a much more powerful effect than if you just take the simile out of context. And this support idea that these epics are a kind consummate Apollonian style. And the Apollonian style being not what some might think from ways misused by many online now, but it's not about logic and reason, moderation as such. It's about achieving calm, trance-like, hypnotic dream state in which you can see perhaps the future and the past and hidden connections of things that are, in which you are also able to witness the most terrible things, the kind of murder scenes and such that I read on some previous segments, and to have them be completely transfigured so that you're not affected emotionally by them, that even the most violent thing can become beautiful. It's an aesthetic transfiguration of the world in a trance state of imagery that again makes morality and moralism, I think, a moot point. The world of the Greeks prior to Homer and other bards like Homer, it was a brutish dark age, total violence, might makes right, piracy, genocide, and it was Homer who brought the light-filled gods out of their hiding. And I'm being a bit poetic myself now, but I really do mean that men like Homer and Pindar, literally as seer prophets, not just bards, they were emissaries of Apollo or founders of a new kind of religion, maybe you can say, re-establishers maybe of the ancient Aryan religion that is only approximated in other extant epics, say, for example, the Norse and the Vedas and such. But nowhere else are the gods born to the dream eye of your mind in such luminous power, or the world transfigured by this eye of the artist, which really to say it's the mantic as you see here is behind the simile. And if you want to see a lineage of what a seer is, you read Pindar 6th Pythian Ode, where he tells the story of the birth of Iamos. He's a seer, a prophet, and how Apollo gave him the second sight and prophecy, and I may quote it later. But here then is another favorite example of simile from end of book 8, a famous simile and another favorite. So with hearts made high, these sat night long by the outworks of battle, and their watchfires blazed new. He's telling about they are sitting on plain with campfires, military campfires. Okay, so sorry, let me begin again. So with hearts made high, these sat night long by the outworks of battle, and their watchfires blazed numerous about them. As when in the sky the stars about the moon's shining are seen in all their glory, when the air has fallen to stillness, and all the high places of the hills are clear, and the shoulders outjutting, and the deep ravines, as endless bright air spills from the heavens, and all the stars are seen to make glad the heart of the shepherd. Such in their numbers blazed the watchfires the Trojans were burning between the waters of Xanthos and the ships before Ilion. 1,000 fires were burning there in the plain, and besides each one sat 50 men in the flare of the blazing firelight. And standing each beside his chariot, champing white barley and oats, the horses waited for the dawn to mount to her high place. Again, there's something much exhilarating. If you have ever been alone on a field, an open field at night, about the comparison of the vastness of nature, overwhelming lone shepherd in sublime way, comparison of that to the number of fires of army camping at night, is both supreme calm, exhilarating, imagistic. It reminds me, feel of if you see Star Wars or Dune, the best moments where they seem to achieve a kind of futuristic mythic feel. I think they are going for this Iliad feel. I think it tells the story of something that happened originally in outer space. Yes, I think this. But the comparison of the armies to natural phenomenon is frequent and always just so appropriate. I mean, here is a rousing set of similes. I'm going to read for you a rousing set of similes right before the catalogue of ships in Book 2. I'm reading now. As obliterating fire lights up a vast forest along the crests of a mountain, and the flare shows far off, so as they marched from the magnificent bronze, the gleam went dazzling all about through the upper air to the heaven. These, as the multitudinous nations of birds winged, of geese and of cranes and of swans long-throated, in the Asian meadow besides the Caistrian waters, this way and that way they make their flights in the pride of their wings. Then they settle in clashing swarms, and the whole meadow echoes with them. So of these the multitudinous tribes from the ships and shelters poured to the plain of Scamandros, and the earth beneath their feet and under the feet of their horses thundered horribly. They took position in the blossoming meadow of Scamandros, thousands of them, as leaves and flowers appear in their season. Like the multitudinous nations of swarming insects, who drive hither and thither about the stalls of a sheepfold in the season of spring when the milk splashes in the milk pails. In such numbers the flowing-haired Achaeans stood up through the plain against the Trojans, hearts burning to break them. These, as men who are goatherds among the white goat flocks, easily separate them in order as they take to the pasture. Thus the leaders separated them this way and that toward the encounter, and among them powerful Agamemnon, with eyes and head like Zeus who delights in thunder, like Ares for girth with the chest of Poseidon, like some ox of the herd preeminent among the others, a bull who stands conspicuous in the huddling cattle. Such was the son of Atreus, as Zeus made him that day, conspicuous among men and foremost among the fighters. Tell me now, you muses, who have your homes on Olympus, for you who are goddesses are there, and you know all things, and we have heard only the rumor of it and know nothing. Who then of those who were the chief men and the lords of the Danaans? I could not tell over the multitude of them, nor name them. Anyway, he continues this, but how you feel this? I think, again, the contrast is always so appropriate, inspires such expansive, calm vision of nature in the reader. This affected me immediately when I read it, whereas the Bible did not. The Bible is Arabic feel. If you listen to rhetoric of Osama bin Laden, is very similar to Bible rhetoric in the sense that it has very good and emotional poetry often, and maybe at times even more grand and ostentatious than what you find in Greek poetry like this, but it's very rare to find this kind of searing imagery in the Bible. There are sometimes nice emotional metaphors, but rarely simile and cinematic imagery of this kind. And there is beautiful poetry, but there is no visual, luminous transfiguration of the world. I do think the similes in Homer are driving at some type deep understanding of what it is that underlies nature. But it's presented implicitly without priestly doctrine, because the seer is a seer, he's not a priest, he's not a handler of legalisms and laws and rituals necessarily. He's a seer, he has a gift of second sight. So to continue, for example, at the end of the last similes I read, the comparison was made between animal and the leaders of the Greeks, in particular Agamemnon, who is, maybe you can say he's not a good guy in the Iliad. He's a still magnificent king, and this is his greatest moment of glory. In other words, even an inadequate king as such is transformed into magnificent king, transfigured by the gods in moment of battle, and stands in a position to draw others around him in a kind of natural orbit, and his animal nature as a bull among the herd comes out. And this is a big point, I think, in comparison to animal are not coincidence. Consider in fifth book, this is the Aristeia, the moment of glory of Diomedes, where he again is compared to animal. It's a nice longer passage that I will read. And this come after Diomedes has just been wounded by an arrow. So I'm reading now. Come, dear friend, son of Capaneus, step down from the chariot. This is his charioteer friend. Come, dear friend, son of Capaneus, step down from the chariot so that you may pull out from my shoulder this bitter arrow. So he spoke, and Sthenelus sprang to the ground from his chariot, and standing beside him, pulled the sharp arrow clean through his shoulder, and the blood shot up spurting through the delicate tunic. Now Diomedes of the great war cry spoke aloud, praying, Hear me now, Atritone, daughter of Zeus and of the Aegis. If ever before in kindliness you stood by my father through the terror of fighting, be my friend now also, Athena. Grant me that I may kill this man and come with spear cast, who shot me before I could see him, and now boasts over me, saying that I cannot live to look much longer on the shining sunlight. So he spoke in prayer, and Pallas Athena heard him. She made his limbs light again, and his feet, and his hands above them, and standing close beside him, she spoke and addressed him in winged words. Be of good courage now, Diomedes, to fight with the Trojans, since I have put inside your chest the strength of your father, untremulous, such as the horseman Tydeus of the great shield had. I have taken away the mist from your eyes, that before now was there, so that you may well recognize the god and the mortal. Therefore now, if a god making trial of you comes hither to you, do you not battle head-on with the gods immortal, not with the rest, but only if Aphrodite, Zeus' daughter, comes to fighting, her at least you may stab with the sharp bronze. She spoke thus, grey-eyed Athena, and went while Tydeus' son closed once again with the champions, taking his place there. Raging as he had been before to fight with the Trojans, now the strong rage triple took hold of him, as of a lion, whom the shepherd among his fleecy flocks in the wild lands grazed as he leapt the fence of the fold, but has not killed him, but only stirred up the lion's strength, and can no more fight him off, but hides in the steading, and the frightened sheep are forsaken, and these are piled pell-mell on each other in heaps, while the lion, raging, still leaps out again over the fence of the deep yard. Such was the rage of strong Diomedes as he closed with the Trojans. Next he killed Astynous and Hyperion, Hypeiron, shepherd of the people, striking one with the bronze-heeled spear above the nipple, and cutting the other beside the shoulder through the collarbone. I stop reading now. You get the comparison to lion, which, by the way, lions lived in this part of the world, in Greece and the Balkans during this time. There's a kind of lion. But there is a book, I think, written about just this, the comparisons to animals, a bit of a pedantic book, but but trying to make an evolutionary Darwinist case for why these kinds of likeliness to animal matter, and to situate Homeric heroes and their struggle for fame and women and plunder in a Darwinist model. But I think that is a bit of a kind of literal reductionist distortion, a downgrade, given that the main character chooses a young death knowingly. I haven't read this book I'm talking about, the evolutionary understanding of the Homeric heroes, but it may be worthwhile anyway. But animal comparison, very important in Homer. Consider one of most striking similes, where Achilles' warriors and his companions, his Myrmidons, as he rouses them to battle finally, and they are compared to a pack of wolves. But Achilles went meanwhile to the Myrmidons and arrayed them all in their war gear along the shelters, and they as wolves who tear flesh raw, in whose hearts the battle fury is tireless, who have brought down a great horned stag in the mountains, and then feed on him till the jowls of every wolf run blood, and then go all in a pack to drink from a spring of dark running water, lapping with their lean tongues along the black edge of the surface and belching up the clotted blood. In the heart of each one is a spirit untremulous, but their bellies are full and groaning. As such the lords of the Myrmidons and their men of counsel around the brave henchmen of swift-footed Aeacides swarmed, and among them was standing warlike Achilles, and urged on the fighting men with their shields and the horses. Yes, the wolf society of Apollo, the Mannerbund, you see here in ferocious glory. What is Sir Homer trying to say when he sees this, or he compared them to angry chimp-out wild boar in whose chest churns an engine of undying combat and defiance? I was afraid I would run into a wild boar. I was walking not long ago in North Spain, and I wrote immediately hiker friend. You may know him, Weird Hiker, on Twitter, and I asked him, can I challenge boar if I see him to make him run? And he said, no, you stay very wide from boar. If you try to challenge, they are one of the most easily angered animals, and they will chimp out and kill. Be careful. But what this means in Homer, I cannot give you some glib, quick answer. I think truth lies in the images themselves. I give you a clue what I think it means by read something unrelated and end this segment with one of most beautiful, touching similes, the death of Euphorbus. And remember what I say, is that a modern would shudder if they understood how the Greeks themselves experienced the death scenes in the Iliad. And here is the death of Euphorbus, which so affected Pythagoras that he believed he was a reincarnation of this hero I'm about to talk about, Euphorbus. And indeed, Pythagoras was able to find, through the memory of this past life, he was able to know what was hidden behind Euphorbus' shield before anyone had looked. And when they looked on the back, they found, yes, Pythagoras was saying the truth. This is a famous story. But anyway, here is death of Euphorbus for more Homeric comparison between hero and animal, or rather in this case, a beautiful tree. He's getting killed by Menelaus, okay, so it's a little bit longer passage. Then, lordly Menelaus, you must now pay the penalty for my brother whom you killed, and boast that you did it, and made his wife a widow in the depth of a young bride chamber, and left to his parents the curse of lamentation and sorrow. Yet I might stop the mourning of these unhappy people if I could carry back to them your head and your armor, and toss them to Panthos' hands and to Phrontis the lovely. No, this struggle shall not go long untested between us, nor yet unfought, whether it prove our strength or our terror. He spoke and stabbed Menelaus' shield in its perfect circle, nor did the bronze break its way through, but the spearhead bent back in the strong shield. And after him Atreus' son, Menelaus, made his prayer to Father Zeus and lunged with the bronze spear as he was drawing back, caught him in the pit of the gullet, and leaned in on the stroke in the confidence of his strong hand, and clean through the soft part of the neck the spear point was driven. He fell thunderously, and his armor clattered upon him, and his hair, lovely as the graces, was splattered with blood, those braided locks caught waspwise in gold and silver, as some slip of an olive tree, strong growing, that a man raises in a lonely place, and drenched it with generous water, so that it blossoms into beauty, and the blasts of winds from all quarters tremble it, and it bursts into pale blossoming. But then a wind, suddenly in a great tempest descending upon it, wrenches it out of its stand, and lays it at length on the ground. Such was Euphorbus of the strong ash spear, the son of Panthous, whom Menelaus Atreides killed, and was stripping his armor. As when in the confidence of his strength some lion, hill-reared, snatches the finest cow in a herd as it pastures. First the lion breaks her neck, caught fast in the strong teeth, then gulps down the blood and all the guts that are inward savagely, as the dogs and the herdsmen raise a commotion loudly about him, but from a distance, and are not willing to go in and face him, since the hard green fear has hold of them. So no heart in the breast of any Trojan had courage to go in and face glorious Menelaus. Yes, do you like this? And if you think such scene is both tragic and exhilarating and also highly eroticize a beautiful death, you would be right on all counts. But what maybe this means, if anything else, I will be right back to discuss. The opening scene of the Iliad, where the body is extolled by the but the psyche, the soul or the spirit in our language, is seen as something unimportant. But that already is such a big clue about what life means and how Homer saw meaning of life force of cosmos, and of why it is of a higher and alien intelligence that can only appear to us transfigured in something we might recognize as aesthetic trance. I will be right back. Suppose I should say a word about Ricky Vaughn. I know him as Ricky Vaughn. I like to call people by the code names under which I first knew them. But the Douglas Mackey case, where he was recently convicted, what is there to say other than the United States now shows itself as a shithole communist country? Many people have made this observation that in the same week, Trump, ex-president, is indicted. Guy is convicted for a funny meme, and then they celebrate Trans Day celebration on the same week that a Troon shoots up a school. So this situation, but I think if you can, you should donate to Douglas Mackey Defense Fund, because he has good lawyers. This case we wanted to remain hopeful, but it was long shot because it was in Brooklyn. They put the case in Brooklyn because the fiber optic cables went through Brooklyn, if you can believe that, and that's how they were able to choose this kind of jury that would convict. And they were convicted based on a very vague law that if it doesn't get overturned by extreme court, can be used not just against any frog, but any American at all. So if you can, please donate to his legal defense fund. He will take to Supreme Court. He will win. I wish him power, and I know that he will not go to jail for this idiocy. However, the damage to free speech is already done. In fact, it was done simply by this going to trial because, as you know, the process is the punishment and so on. But now with the conviction is very bad situation, even if it get reverse Supreme Court, which it has to be, you know. But even if it does, it's already so much damage, so much intimidation already on anyone looking at this will think twice. Do I make fun of this politician? Can they use this law against me? Like I say, everything they allege about Russia is true about United States, but in some way much worse. As I say, shithole communist country. That's all I have to say. I prefer talk about Iliad. Iliad, story of armies and war and adventure, but its universe so different from our own that it makes me quite annoyed when modern neocon and other libtard they try to pervert it and to use it to promote their own wars or service, service to the nation, to these rickety sham states, service to rickety sham. Agamemnon, who is commander-in-chief, you can say, of the Greek, and it's not really an army, it's more like a confederation of highly individualistic, ambitious warlords, similar maybe to Afghan warlords or Saxon chiefs, who may temporarily unite under one leader, a commander-in-chief who happens to have the most men. It's interesting in this question of most men, why did that give you some title to rule? It's very interesting because one of constant concerns of Iliad, where the Greeks had many different names for who is stronger, who is better. They had many words for this to distinguish between different kinds of better. And the most important was who is Aristos Achaion, who is the best of the Achaeans. That is question of the most excellent by nature, so to speak, whereas Agamemnon only has the leadership of the Greek Confederation because he is perteros, meaning he is the one who leads the most men and most ships. But I say this because this word perteros, the root is P-H-E-R, but it's the same one that in Germanic languages is baron. So, he's more baronial. He has the strength in size army. But for baron just means warlord, okay? But for a culture really obsessed on who is stronger, mightier, better, and so forth, such concerns, I say, lead to many fine distinctions on this point. And that's really story of Iliad, the story of Achilles' wrath or menace, yes, but really his wrath in sitting out the war is just one of the demonstrations of his natural superiority and excellence. He sits out the war and demonstrates that they will fail without him. Which on a much lower, less artistic scale, you can see it's what Ayn Rand tried to show in Atlas Shrugged, maybe, I think. But the libertarian understanding of human gradations and individual superiority, I think, leaves out usually the physical and military strength and superiority. That's why libertarian ideologies may be deficient. But still, I think people who attacked Ayn Rand, that's become right now on the so-called dissident right, a kind of Norwood trait. What is Norwood? It is a short, balding guy with, who's mad. He's mad and balding, and he's into traditional socialism. And, Ayn Rand, it's easy to attack Ayn Rand. But it's a Norwood trait because to go back to this, why the libertarian ideology, however, is deficient, fundamentally a society that is, let's be funny here, but I think even some libertarians recognize that ultimately the full expression of their beliefs appears in something like Somalia or Afghanistan with competing warlords. Or if you want to look at the non-degenerate version of that, because these are racially degenerate examples, but the non-degenerate examples would be something like the world of the Iliad or the Icelandic Free State, where you had competing warlords, or rather warlord judges, warlord judge priest, who would compete for clients, for basically security company, to put it, competing for clients. So something like what appeared provisionally in the theories of Hans Hermann Hoppe, although there it appears in a Spurg-like version, academic Spurg-like version. But really, this something critics of the might is right worldview, they miss this when they attack might is right. They think Nietzsche, for example, or the ancient versions of Nietzsche as appears in might makes right theories of Critias or other sophists. And some people foolishly believe these are moral justifications for submission to government authority or the authority of any elite, so-called whatsoever, when in fact that misses whole point. They are not arguments for social stability, but for social flux and instability. And societies that held to this belief look something very much like the Iliad or the Icelandic Free State. It was very weak to no central authority and constant warfare and strife and competing strongmen who are always challenging each other's right to rule by means of the duel or some other kind of contest. And whether that's good or bad, or whether it can be refined or updated into a form acceptable in modern circumstances or something more advanced and less brutish is another question. But don't confuse it with Confucianism or such, please, which many traditionalists and actually also liberal and leftist critics of might and right, they always make that confusion as if Nietzsche would support any elite that happens to be in power at any time whatsoever anywhere. That makes no sense. And I think Achilles' example is a very good role model for modern man, by the way, and a very good immunization against the kind of moral cant that wants you to sacrifice your own benefit for that of degenerate modern states and degenerate nations and peoples. Achilles sits out the war because his war prize girl is taken from him, and he does not join back until restitution and apology is made, but really until his friend is killed. So, when a femtard or libtard or conservacock tries to shame you for not serving your country and such, remind them that you owe absolutely nothing to modern states until they offer you concrete benefits, women, gold, many such things, or you owe them nothing at all. Nor is it correct to make a comparison to classical Greece. You may have heard this dishonest argument. They say, well, the heroes of the Iliad and those like Achilles may have been individualistic and over-focused on displaying their personal battle prowess to win their own glory on the battlefield, but by classical times, the Greek phalanx of the hoplites didn't appreciate such behavior. So, in fact, Sparta punished any man who stepped out of line if they tried to chimp out in Homeric fashion. There are famous cases of this as well, where to regain honor, a Spartan would step out of line and go on a chimp out against the enemy, and they were rebuked even if they won. And this is all true, but what these people miss is that these societies look to the Iliad as their Bible and to Achilles as the shining exemplar of the most excellent man, in same way maybe that Christian societies look to Jesus even if they didn't demand that men emulate every aspect of Jesus' life. But it's a big misunderstanding of the phalanx spirit to try to cram it into your own new Chinese socialistic understanding of the collective or the group, because what you had in the phalanx, and yes, they demanded the line be held as a tactic. So, for example, I think at Plataea, the decisive land battle in the Persian Wars, famously a Spartan commander comes and drops a big anchor chained to his leg to show that he will not budge. All true, wonderful, but these were men who literally owned their states. It was a proprietary state of the citizens, the hoplite spirit that this kind of line describes. And by the way, the hoplite also began as an individual adventurer, warrior, and mercenary, and a kind of military entrepreneur. He did not begin as a soldier in a phalanx. They formed the phalanx later, and what I'm saying, it was done for tactical and practical reasons, and the ideology behind it is you're overstating your case if you think it was some type of egalitarian collectivist theology like you have in mind. It was a version of the Mannerbund, or the Brotherhood of Men in Arms, the homoioi, so-called by the, this is the name of the Spartan citizenry, but they viewed themselves as a brotherhood apart from others, superior to others. So really the phalanx described the patrician aristocracy by modern words. They owned the state, they derived all the benefits from this ownership and citizenship. They were getting something concrete for it, in other words, land, yes, women, wealth, ownership in the state, which in the case of Sparta meant a big plot of land plus slaves or serfs to work it, and a woman, your wife, to manage it when you were away at war. Okay, they were not modern peon, faceless soldiers that you are asked to be now, getting nothing in return but pat on the head from a femtard or a libtard neocon as a moral benefit of some kind. There is this man, Andrew Basevich, I think. I do not read him. I know of what he says. I think his son died in Iraq. He's a veteran himself and a professor. He has a book on this matter about how America's performative jingoism, when it comes to this kind of thank you for your service, in fact, it's a way to erase and anonymize the soldier. It's just a piece of sentimental moralism to get men to sacrifice themselves for nothing. My friend Samuel Finley, I should ask him to come on show again. He was much beloved, but he has this book, Breakfast with the Dirt Coat. It make all this point, and he's combat veteran. If you know, so I go on this tangent. It seemed relevant. The Iliad is not about the anonymity of war and of service to a so-called fatherland or a group or a people. In fact, the heroes in it frequently ignore their supposed duties when friendship or booty or personal glory are at stake. And most famously is when a Greek and a Trojan hero meet on battlefield but realize their fathers or grandfathers, I forget, were in a relationship of guest friendship. So they exchange gifts and they depart without fighting. I mean, can you imagine soldiers in a filthy modern democratic struggle doing this? But what's interesting is how do they realize they are related in this matter is because the way warriors in the Iliad fight, they face each other, get off chariot, they recite family lineage, and they trash talk, and then they fight. And it's all, again, presented in this extreme, straightforward, naive, egotistic way. It's glorious and it's refreshing. And it's actually similar to how early Japanese fought. It's also, by the way, in the Norse epics, they have a similar word. I forget what it is in Norse, but in Greek, the word is neikos for feud or vendetta. And there's almost, I forget the word, but it's almost exactly the same in Norse for feud. There's a similar trash talk where, one Viking tells another, you're apathic and the bishop of so-and-so fucked you in the ass and got you pregnant in the ass and so on. It's a very wild thing. It's very dominated by Doug literature. You see, can I say this on family show? But this is what epic heroic culture was like. And there's a Japanese chronicle that recounts their victory over the invading Mongols. But at first, the Japanese experienced some reverses because, as these chronicles say, we are used to fighting. A man comes on horseback, comes out of the ranged hosts on horseback, shouts out his family lineage, and calls out his preferred opponent from the enemy army to challenge a duel with. And then the other guy comes and, they do the Iliad thing. And the Japanese were just taken aback that the Mongols didn't respect this at all, but were just swarming them with steppe chimp tactics, But eventually they pushed back the Mongols. They were saved by divine wind storm, kamikaze, which, if the Japanese honored their spirits again, kamikaze could help them in our time as well. I believe this. This was Shintaro Ishihara. I cannot get into that. But in animism and in Greek religion, or let's say Greek religion of very primeval times, the relationship you had with spirits and gods was also individualistic and aristocratic. It was reciprocal. I shouldn't say just primeval times. It was this way through classical Greek times too. The Greek man, which is to say, really the aristocracy, as those were the real Greeks, they saw themselves in the relation to their gods as, let's say, lower nobility sees itself in relation to dukes and kings and such. And so in a feudal relation of this kind, there is a reciprocity. This is how the bard understood himself. You make a prayer to a god in the form of a very innovative poem that's beautiful and that brings honor and glory to that god. The art of reverence and glorification of another basically is lost today, aside from myself. But this gift to the god obligated that god in turn to bestow on you or your patron good fortune or health and wealth, good form, many other such things that are prayed for. And in the Iliad, to return to basic idea of Iliad, you see that again, it's not really a story of Achilles' wrath, but of his godlike, the exhibition of a kind of godlike inner power that he has, of his arete, of his excellence by nature, which, excuse the attack, which in its sudden eruption, the arete, this nature, its sudden eruption into the world, is the manifestation of truth and awesome beauty. And so really the wrath he displays in the beginning is just a setup for his moment of Aristeia, of his wrath on the battlefield later in the epic. And both are presented simultaneously divine phenomena and akin to natural events of great power, like might of river, many such things. So one of the big themes running through book is Achilles' likeness to the god Apollo. You can see this in many ways, but it appeared very early, including in passage I recited for you, and when Apollo come very angry and spread disease among the Greek army. And the second mention of the word menace or wrath, I believe, is in the mouth of the prophet or mantic or shaman Calchas, who refers to Apollo's menace in this punishment of Greek army because the Agamemnon had dishonored, remember, the priest, the local priest of Apollo, Chryses, But if you listen to my brief recitation, maybe of this beginning of the Iliad, I read this part of the scene. It's toward the end of what I recited, where they neigh, terrible was the clang of Apollo's bow with which he shot disease at the army host. But yes, you see, Apollo is called the mouse god Zmintheus, and I think because, right, why would a rodent be the sign of such a magnificent god? Because Apollo, god of health, is also god of epidemics. And they saw that mice, rats, spread disease. So Apollo becomes also a mouse god, among many other things. This is why Chryses invokes him as Sminteo. But Homer quite explicit about this. Immediately after the first stanza, which I began show with, he asks, who was it who set the two great men of the Greeks, Achilles and Agamemnon, against each other? It was the son of Leto and Zeus, Apollo. And his wrath, which is the natural phenomena of pestilence on the Greek army that leads to pyres of corpses. This is a divine copy of Achilles' own wrath that leads throughout the book to exactly the same thing, merely by sitting out the war. And then the second connection to the word menace, which, by the way, has direct parallels in both old Iranian Avestan and in Rig Vedas, in words that sound something like Mainu. And it refers there to a god of war and fire, although you always have to be careful about using Zoroastrianism as a guide to understanding the mental universe of the ancient Aryans. Zoroastrianism already is a reform religion that actually very much went against the original Aryan spirit on purpose. It attempted to ban, for example, the Mannerbund, the Society of Warriors, and to taboo and demonize not only this as an institution, the Society of Warriors, but also its spiritual presuppositions. But it's clear from general usage in other Indo-European language, and especially in the Vedas, that this word menace with which the Iliad starts, a kind of anger, isn't just some random word for anger or wrath. It has cosmic significance, and in fact, more closely related to forms of perception than emotion. In Greek, the root word would be something like mne, having to do with remembrance and perception and with mind. Mind, right? I believe same root word. It's something that vague to us today, but refers to the general activation of some type of superhuman mind. And this is why, as Calvert Watkin point out, mortals in the Iliad almost never refer to their own menace. When they talk about their own anger casually, they use several other words, but this particular one, menace, is very rarely used. Not never, but very rarely. It is obviously a taboo word. And Watkins explained it as a taboo deformation, so-called, of a more general word for the activated mind or mindfulness that somehow reflect one of vital life forces of the world, which is why in Greek it's often associated, this word menace, with Zeus and his fiery thunderbolt. Just as in the Vedas, it's associated with Indra himself, maybe you can say a divine version of Achilles. It's not blind rage. It's not moral indignation. Heraclitus, in a quite different setting, but refers to the thunderbolt of Zeus has a certain intelligence. It is a kind of directed guide. It's a kind of cosmic, intelligent, directed mindfulness akin to wrath, maybe, but that brings doom on entire peoples and nations. And I don't know if the word for mantis, the prophet or seer, is related even indirectly, but it's worth saying now that Achilles first appeared in a plot of Iliad as the defender and the introducer, stupid word, but he introduces the mantis, the seer, the shaman Calchas, who, like the Trojan priest trying to free his daughter, Calchas is also a man of Apollo. This is what I was saying. Homer very explicit on Apollo-Achilles connection in this book. And Achilles, when he appears first, he's roused to anger when Agamemnon dismisses Calchas, mistreats him. Calchas is saying you have to give the daughter back to the priest to make restitution and make, but Agamemnon mistreats him. So, Achilles always in beginning appears as a kind of defender and champion of the god Apollo and of his priests, and in particular of his seers and prophets, because Apollo is god of far-seeing prophecy. And so when Calchas, the shaman, is first introduced, Homer refers to him as he who sees the things that are, that were, and that will be, and who by his divine madness given to him by Apollo led the Greeks to Ilion. In other words, the art of navigation across the seas. At least in this case, it was through divine inspiration that this shaman led the Greeks over the seas to their target. In Pindar Olympian Ode 6, I may have mentioned it earlier, there is also a reference to this word for prophetic madness, mantosune, which Apollo gave to his son Iamos. It's a beautiful passage. Should I read it? I will read it, why not? Is very Homeric in feel. And this is about Iamos, a prophetic man. And when he had attained the delightful fruit of golden-crowned youth, he went down into the middle of the Alpheus and called on wide-ruling Poseidon, that's a river, and called on wide-ruling Poseidon, his grandfather, and on the archer, his father, who watches over god-built Delos, he's talking about Apollo, praying that the honor of caring for the people be on his head under the clear night sky. His father's voice responded in clear speech and sought him out. "Rise, my son, follow my voice here to a place that welcomes all." They came to the steep rock of the lofty cliff of Cronus. There the god gave him a double treasure of prophecy. There and then to hear a voice that did not know how to lie. And when bold plotting Heracles came, the sacred scion of the Alcidae, and founded for his father a festival frequented by mortals and the greatest ritual of contest, he's talking about the Olympics. Then he commanded him to establish an oracle on the highest altar of Zeus. Since then, the race of the sons of Iamos has been very famous throughout Greece, he means as prophets. Prosperity attended them, and by honoring excellence, they walk along a bright path. End quote. And I found it interesting that character in this ode says earlier about the same. He says, "I long for the eye of my army, a man who was good both as a prophet and at fighting with the spear." But this, what I just read for you now, is very common sentiment. That is, the eye of the army is a man who possesses both strong spear and the art of prophecy, which, many of you might be acquainted from, if you had read about Indo-European scholar George Dumézil. He came up with supposedly famous, supposedly tripartite division of ancient Aryan society, saying that all Aryan societies were divided into warriors, priests, and the common man or the common people. And in some cases, there's evidence for this. For example, even in the Japanese, and the Japanese are not Aryan, but they inherited this from some Aryan invaders who came in the 400s AD and so. But if you look at Japanese imperial treasures, their three treasures are a sword, a mirror, and a jewel, which are supposed to correspond to this tripartite division: the sword for the warriors, the mirror for the priestly class, and then the jewel for the fertility of the people. And yes, again, Japan was invaded at one point by a steppe confederation that had Scythian leadership around the 400s AD, I think. And it's assumed that the samurai class existing separately in Japan, which is somewhat of a unique institution in Asia, that it was also inherited from this invasion. Now, and of course, this pattern of tripartite division exists in other so-called Aryan societies, or even societies that were, let's say, touched by Aryan influence, let's say. But that said, I think Dumézil overstates case, because in many Aryan society, the ideal was a warrior who was also a priest, or more precisely, a seer. And so you see now in line I just read from Pindar, who preserves some, say, the scholar Calvert Watkins I mentioned earlier, he say that Pindar preserves extremely ancient beliefs more than Homer does. Although Pindar innovates much more linguistically. But this is not a unique case. It's throughout many different Indo-European or Aryan cultures, call it what you will. It is ancient idea that the great man should exist both as priest and warrior. In the Iliad, for whatever reason, they are separated or secularized. So you have Nestor in the secularized version of it. He's described both as great in battle, but also the most capable of the Greeks at giving counsel. So the priestly or the mind function of the seer is secularized here to giving good advice in general assembly, but Nestor possesses both of them. Or on the other hand, you have the case of Odysseus, who is both a great warrior and famously he also a wise man, and wisecracking wise man at that, a trickster. But there is a very nice element in Iliad where he and Diomedes infest, what am I saying? You see, they try to put false words in my head. They infiltrate Trojan camp, and they do it wearing wolf. They wear wolf thing on head. Again, a replay of Mannerbund, unrelated to what I'm saying now, but I find the episode interesting. But in case of Achilles, some say, where Calchas again is his counterpart in the story, Calchas being the seer of Apollo, the shaman Calchas, the function of the warrior and prophet is for whatever reason separated. So it's cleft into these two characters that are nevertheless very close related in the Iliad. But in many other cases, you see, as again in Pindar line I read, the ideal was, or even the case of Julius Caesar and many other instances in Roman history, the ideal was that the functions of the priest and the warrior are united, in fact. So it's not really given that these are separate classes. I have no special ending for you today. No lesson, I have no point to make. Achilles is the mirror of Apollo. I hope you enjoy my scattered observations on why I like this poem. Next week I return for part 2 to discuss various nice modern books on Homer. Until next time, Bap out!